Welcome to our lecture on the environment and health. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the most important environmental threats to health, especially for low and middle income countries. We're going to review the burden of disease related to environmental risks. We're going to comment on the cost and consequences of key environmental health burdens. And lastly, I hope to describe some of the most cost-effective ways of reducing the global burden of environmental health problems. So what is environmental health? Environmental health are the efforts that are concerned with preventing disease, death, and disability by reducing exposure to adverse environmental conditions and promoting behavioral change. And that's through the World Health Organization. Why are we so concerned about environmental health? Well, environmental risk factors account for about 25% of global burden of disease. The leading causes of death in low middle income countries are related to environmental risk factors, specifically respiratory illness, so COPD, asthma, pneumonia, and diarrheal disease, and it's central to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look specifically at the Sustainable Development Goals, you can see environment and health relates to about 7 of them. So end poverty in all its forms. Number 3 is ensuring healthy lives. Number 5 is achieving gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. 6 is ensuring access to water and sanitation. 7 is ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. Number 10 is related to reducing the inequality within and among countries. And number 13, taking that urgent action to combat climate change. You may wonder about goal number 5, achieve gender equality. Typically, what happens in low middle income countries, and I see this as well in Ghana, is related to water. It's generally the women that are responsible for getting the water for their families. Specifically, if you think about the women who have to walk hours and hours and hours to get water, I shouldn't say hours and hours, who need to walk quite often an hour to get the water. And so this reduces the time that they can spend at school and doing other work, which really does have a negative impact on their health, their well-being, and their education level. So the cost and consequences. It has significant social and economic consequences. The burden falls disproportionately on relatively poor people. There's negative consequences on productivity, particularly for women, and young children are especially at risk for consequences of environmental issues. The 3 key environmental health burdens that we're going to focus in on are household air pollution, ambient particulate matter pollution, so air pollution, and water, sanitation, and hygiene. So let's start off with household air pollution. 3 billion people in the world depend on solid fuel for cooking and heating. So solid fuel is not a clean fuel. It's a fuel that comes from wood, charcoal, coal, and dung. And dung is basically animal waste that's used to burn a fire. It's anywhere where you can get any type of fire for a source of energy for cooking. And so women will typically be cooking over these solid fuels along with their children in a very enclosed space. Poorer populations are more susceptible. The short-term problems are conjunctivitis from burning, upper respiratory infection, acute respiratory infection, and sometimes carbon monoxide poisoning. I see a lot of children in my clinics in northern Ghana that come in with pneumonia for this reason. Mom is cooking inside their hut, or sometimes inside their hut with no ventilation, but also cooking outside their hut as well. They're still exposed to these solid fuels. The long-term associations are cardiovascular disease, COPDs, and cancers. And we definitely do see a lot of COPDs and asthma in our mothers. So just looking at overall risk, it's the eighth most important risk factor for deaths globally. It's a cause of 3.8 million deaths yearly. And it's the 4th most important risk factor in high mortality, low and middle income countries. So it's really up there as a high mortality. It relates to, has a high mortality rate. So how do we reduce the burden? Well, we start off by looking at improving the cooking devices and using less polluting fuels. Reduce the needs for fuel by maybe using solar cooking and heating. Using mechanisms for venting the smoke. So if a mom is cooking inside their hut, to cook possibly outside or have some type of venting. Use dried fuels for cooking, and then also keeping children away from cooking areas. So we're really trying to promote at least cooking outdoors for sure, and also trialing some different cooking devices which are economically reasonable for people for individuals living in these areas. Let's talk about outdoor air pollution, so ambient particulate matter pollution. And so the common effects are respiratory symptoms, including cough, irritation of nose and throat, and shortness of breath. Older and younger people tend to be more susceptible. If you think about the common air pollutants, you have them here. So carbon monoxide, we know mostly comes from our cars, and it causes a reduction in oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Lead causes brain and central nervous system damage and also digestive problems. Your nitrogen dioxide and your oxides causing damage to the lungs and respiratory. Ozone causes breathing impairment and eye irritation. Particulate matter is a cause of respiratory irritation and lung damage. Smog, the same. Sulfur dioxide, again, respiratory problems. And volatile organic compounds, these are things such as insolvents, again, similar to smog, but it can also be a carcinogen. So outdoor air pollution causes 4.2 million deaths. And it's interesting that 90% of those occur in low and middle income countries who are not contributing to the air pollution, the outdoor air pollution. India and China have major burdens of related diseases along with other countries in Asia and Eastern Europe. So how do we reduce it? Well, we introduce unleaded gasoline in areas that don't have it. Thinking about limiting the type of engines that are allowed. So using, having a ban on two-stroke engines. Maybe shift to natural gas if possible. Tightens the emissions inspections and reduce the burning of garbage that we typically see in low middle income countries. Third is water, sanitation, and hygiene. So the stats are 71% of the global population have access to safe drinking water, so leaving about 30% that don't. Failure to properly dispose of human waste is associated with an increase in transmission of pathogens through an oral fecal route, the spread of parasitic worms, and water pathogens are associated with diarrhea and other GI problems. So I see a lot of diarrhea in the population, in the child populations that I see, and a lot of them are become very, very dehydrated. So typically with sanitation, water, and hygiene, the burden typically falls on children and the poor in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. We definitely see a link between unsafe sanitation, unsafe water, poor hygienic practices, and the burden of diarrheal disease. And so reducing the burden of disease, if we look at it from a sanitation perspective, it's implementing those simple methods of sanitation and excretia disposal, which are low cost and relatively effective. So building pit latrines is one way. One of the big barriers is lack of knowledge, for one. So the understanding that open defecation or the importance of sanitation and how it can reduce diarrhea is important. Other barriers for sure would be the cost and construction, and are there any local laws around this? There are government subsidies and regulations for installing latrines, and it's very important to involve the community, as community-based approaches are really important, and that's something that we've definitely done with the NGO that I work with. Now, I couldn't find a picture of the latrines that we've installed in quite a few of the villages that we work in, but it's very similar to this. This is a number of pit latrines that we have implemented in many of the villages that we work in. So next up, I want to show you a quick video about Bill Gates and looking at a different type of sanitation system or a different type of toilet.
I want to talk to you today about toilets. In rich countries, you just take the toilet for granted. It's magical that there's a sewer system bringing water in, taking away the waste, and it all gets cleaned up in a processing plant. However, for the poorest 2.5 billion in the world, they don't have this. It's unaffordable. We can't build that for everyone in the world. Some of the poorest, their toilet may look like this, a pit latrine. The waste here is not processed. It's still going to get out into the community. They smell terrible. But everybody should have great sanitation. A toilet in their house that is comfortable and doesn't smell awful. Not only is a toilet make your life comfortable, getting rid of that waste is key to human health. It's unprocessed waste that causes most of the diarrheal diseases. It ends up with lots of kids being malnourished. So how do we solve this? Well, some scientists that I work with said that we should challenge the world to come up with a way of taking the waste and processing it locally. We call this the program to Reinvent the Toilet. Several reinvented toilets are being tested right now in Durban, South Africa. Durban's a good place to run these tests because the city is growing fast and many people there don't have modern sanitation, which means that even if they have access to a toilet, the waste can get into the environment and make people sick. A typical toilet needs water, but many of the new approaches don't require any water at all. Some of them don't need electricity either. Others run on solar power. All of them remove the pathogens from the waste. And most importantly, they don't have to be connected to the city sewer system. I'm optimistic that eventually we'll find approaches that make great sanitation available to everyone.
So let's look at reducing the burden of disease with respect to the water supply. And it's all about improving water sources, whether you connect water to a house through a house connection, whether there's a stand post where you can pump water. Other areas are look at boreholes or a dug well, or maybe rainfall collection. But investments in water alone do not have the greatest impacts on reductions in diarrheal mortality or morbidity. It's the hygiene investments which are critical to realizing water and sanitation benefits. And so if you look at the potential morbidity reduction from excellent water supply alone, yes, you do have certain conditions that will have a percentage reduction. So scabies, typhoid fever, trachoma, most diarrheal diseases, and dysentery, skin and subcutaneous infections, and paratyphoid or other salmonellas. But a big part of it is hygiene, so for diarrheal disease. And so hygiene promotion can lead to a 33% reduction in diarrhea morbidity. And the focus really should be on the importance of hand washing and enabling hand washing. And hand washing associated with significant reductions, or hand washing has been associated with significant reductions in respiratory infections as well. So it's simply ensuring that if you can bring clean water to a community, you can also bring the ability to have water stations, just like this water station that's been set up here. And so again, it's promoting the importance of hygiene and specifically hand washing. So, if you were to look at where to start with respect to choices about water, sanitation, and hygiene, in order of priority, it's recommended you start with hygiene. And so, it's important to promote hygiene for its own sake, but also to maximize the effects of other investments. So, hygiene, again, specifically, we're talking water and sanitation, sorry, water and hand washing. Sanitation would be the next, so importance of looking at government promotion of low-cost sanitation schemes, and then water, the development of low-cost water supply schemes. So some of the future challenges ahead would definitely be the population growth that we've already talked about. Pollution management is really important. Community-based approaches to reach rural populations, where those are the individuals that have the most diarrhea, the most pneumonias, and the most burden of disease from environmental health issues. Better information and teaching, and engaging those sectors beyond health. So the main messages are important environmental health issues include the lack of safe water and sanitation, poor access to hand washing facilities, household air pollution, and ambient particulate matter. Environmental health issues have a large impact on the poor. And when accompanied by improved hygiene, improved access to water reduces the burden of diarrheal disease. And there are high impact, low cost solutions to environmental health issues. And these include using improved stoves, building latrines, making accessible hand washing stations, and taking intersectoral approaches or the health in all policies to reduce the ambient particular or the particulate matter pollution, so that outdoor air pollution.